The clock on Vladimir Putin's war machine may finally be running out. For the first time since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the conflict has reached deep inside Russian territory in a way that no Kremlin narrative, no state television broadcast, and no carefully choreographed Victory Day parade can obscure or explain away. What unfolded in the span of a single 24-hour period sent shockwaves through Moscow's military establishment, rattled the foundations of Russia's domestic energy economy, and demonstrated to the world that Ukraine has developed a strategic strike capability that Russia's vaunted air defense network, once considered among the most formidable in the world, is no longer able to reliably stop. Subscribe to Hale Reports, because what you are about to hear represents the most comprehensive, deeply sourced, and analytically rigorous breakdown of this extraordinary military and geopolitical development available anywhere. This is the story behind the headlines, the operational detail, the strategic context, the economic consequences, and the political tremors that are now rippling outward from those burning refineries deep inside Russian territory. In a single day, Ukrainian forces launched what military analysts are now describing as the most operationally significant drone strike campaign of the entire war. Over 150 unmanned aerial systems were deployed simultaneously across 9 Russian regions, overwhelming air defense coordination centers, saturating radar networks, and reaching targets that Russia's military leadership had long considered safely beyond the practical reach of Ukrainian offensive operations. The Russian Ministry of Defense, in its official statement, claimed that 154 drones were intercepted and destroyed. But the fires burning across multiple Russian cities told a different story, one that no official intercept count could credibly contradict. From the Volga industrial heartland to the southern approaches near Rostov, from the manufacturing corridors of Nizhny Novgorod to the refinery complexes of Samara Oblast, explosions erupted at facilities that represent the physical infrastructure of Russia's war economy. The Novokuibyshevsk refinery, an 8.8 million metric ton annual capacity Rosneft asset located in Samara Oblast, and one of the most significant petroleum processing facilities in the entire Russian Federation, was struck and engulfed in fire. The Transneft Gorky pumping station, a critical node in the pipeline network that moves Russian crude and refined products across the country, was similarly hit. These were not random targets. These were the economic arteries of a state that has financed a prolonged military campaign through hydrocarbon revenues, and the people who planned these strikes understood precisely what they were hitting and why. To understand the full significance of what happened, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, not just to the beginning of this particular strike campaign, but to the broader strategic evolution that made it possible. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukrainian air defense capabilities were widely assessed as inadequate to withstand sustained Russian air attack. Western analysts predicted that Russian air superiority would be established within days, and that Ukrainian military infrastructure would be systematically dismantled from above. That assessment proved comprehensively wrong, for reasons that are now well understood. Russian air power never achieved the kind of systematic, coordinated suppression of Ukrainian air defenses that military doctrine required, and Ukrainian forces demonstrated an adaptive capacity that surprised virtually every Western intelligence assessment made before the war began. What has happened since then is a long, grinding, and extraordinarily costly war of attrition, in which both sides have suffered devastating losses, but in which the trajectory of military capability has not moved in the direction that Russia's pre-war planning assumed. Ukraine has received increasingly sophisticated weapons systems from Western partners. Its military has developed operational expertise through more than 3 years of high-intensity combat that no training exercise can replicate. And its drone program, drawing on a combination of domestic production, international support, and genuine engineering ingenuity, has evolved from a tactical battlefield tool into a strategic strike capability of genuine significance. The drone campaign that unfolded over this single 24-hour period did not emerge spontaneously. It was the product of months of systematic preparation. what analysts who have studied the operational pattern describe as a deliberate radar hunt. Before a mass drone strike can succeed against a defended target, the attacker needs to understand where the defender's radar systems are located, what their coverage arcs look like, where the gaps and blind spots in the defensive network lie, and how the defender's command and control architecture processes and responds to incoming threats. Building that picture requires patience, persistent intelligence collection, and a willingness to sacrifice individual assets in probing operations that reveal defensive responses. Ukraine has been conducting exactly that kind of systematic intelligence preparation for an extended period. Smaller drone operations, conducted over weeks and months preceding the major strike, served multiple purposes simultaneously. They tested Russian air defense responses, forcing radar systems to activate and reveal their positions. They degraded specific components of the defensive network through direct strikes. They consumed Russian interceptor missiles, a finite and increasingly constrained resource in engagements that imposed a favorable exchange ratio on Moscow's defenders. And they habituated Russian air defense crews to a pattern of drone operations that could then be disrupted by a sudden, massive escalation in scale and simultaneity. The scale of that escalation is what made the most recent operation so militarily significant. Air defense systems are designed to handle a certain volume of simultaneous threats. They have defined engagement envelopes. The number of targets that can be tracked and engaged at the same time is limited by the capacity of the radar systems and the fire control computers that manage the engagement process. When the number of incoming threats exceeds that capacity, the system must make choices about which targets to engage and which to allow through. A sufficiently large and simultaneous wave of incoming drones can therefore achieve penetration not because it defeats the air defense system in a technical sense, but because it overwhelms the system's capacity to process and respond to the threat volume it faces. Russia's air defense network, which at the beginning of the war represented a genuinely formidable layered architecture including S-400 long-range systems, Buk M3 medium-range batteries, and Pantsir short-range point defense systems, has been substantially degraded over the course of the conflict. The losses are not speculative. They are documented through open-source intelligence analysis, satellite imagery, and the assessments of multiple Western defense intelligence organizations. Over 1,300 air defense systems of various types have been destroyed, damaged, or captured since February 2022, according to cumulative tracking by organizations including Oryx, which maintains a meticulously sourced database of confirmed equipment losses for both sides. The remaining systems have been concentrated around the highest priority targets: Moscow, the presidential residences and command facilities, and key military installations. This concentration has been militarily rational from a Kremlin perspective, but it has had a direct and measurable consequence for the protection of provincial cities, industrial facilities, and the energy infrastructure that Russia's war economy depends upon. The decision to prioritize the protection of Moscow and Putin's personal security installations over the defense of the industrial regions that generate the economic output sustaining the war effort reflects a set of political priorities that are distinct from purely military ones. It reflects an assessment by the Kremlin that the greatest immediate threat to the regime's survival is not a military defeat on the battlefield, but domestic political instability, protests, dissent, the visible humiliation of the leadership class in the capital city. By concentrating defensive resources around Moscow and around Putin's residences, the Kremlin has made an explicit choice to protect its own political survival at the expense of its economic lifelines. That choice has now produced exactly the consequence that a more militarily rational distribution of resources might have avoided. The provincial energy facilities that power Russia's war economy, the refineries, the pumping stations, the pipeline infrastructure, have been left exposed, and Ukraine has systematically exploited that exposure in a campaign that is simultaneously a military operation and an economic warfare strategy of considerable sophistication. The economic dimensions of the strikes deserve careful analysis because they connect the battlefield in Ukraine to financial markets, energy prices, and economic calculations in capitals far from the front lines. Russia's war in Ukraine has been financed primarily through hydrocarbon revenues, oil and gas, export income that has continued to flow despite Western sanctions because major economies including China, India, and Turkey have continued purchasing Russian energy at discounted prices. This revenue stream has been essential to maintaining the state budget at a level that can sustain military spending while also providing the domestic economic subsidies and social transfers that have kept overt public dissatisfaction below the threshold of organized political resistance. Every barrel of oil that cannot be refined because a refinery is on fire is a barrel of export revenue that does not reach the Russian state budget. Every day that a major refining facility is offline for repairs represents a measurable reduction in the fuel production capacity that supplies both the military tanks, aircraft, artillery, logistics vehicles all run on refined petroleum products, and the domestic civilian economy. The cumulative effect of Ukraine's sustained targeting of Russian energy infrastructure over the past year has already been assessed by economists studying the Russian war economy as having imposed costs running into the billions of dollars. The strikes that have now struck some of the largest and most important facilities in Russia's refining network escalate that economic pressure substantially. The Novokuibyshevsk refinery is not a peripheral installation. It is one of Russia's major refining facilities, processing nearly 9 million metric tons of crude oil annually and producing refined products that move through the domestic distribution system to fuel stations, industrial users, and military logistics chains across a wide geographic area. Taking that facility offline, even temporarily, creates a supply disruption that reverberates through the regional economy and imposes real costs on both civilian consumers and military logistics planners. The Transneft Gorky pumping station serves a similarly central function in the pipeline network, and damage to it affects the movement of crude oil to refineries and export terminals across a significant portion of Russia's producing regions. The financial consequences have been immediate and visible. Russian energy futures markets have registered the impact of the strikes, and the broader pattern of sustained infrastructure targeting has contributed to maintaining the discount at which Russian crude trades relative to global benchmarks, a discount that reduces the revenue Moscow receives for every barrel it sells, regardless of the global oil price. Russia's war budget, which analysts estimate is now consuming well over $100 million per day in direct military expenditure, is facing a growing gap between revenue and expenditure that is being partially filled through inflation, currency depreciation, and the kind of financial engineering that has historically been the precursor to more serious economic deterioration. Inside Russia itself, the political and social consequences of the drone strikes extend well beyond the immediate economic damage. The sight of fires burning at major industrial facilities inside Russia, transmitted through social media, through independent Russian-language telegram channels that Moscow's censors have been unable fully to suppress, and through the coverage of international media, has produced a visible and measurable impact on Russian public opinion in ways that official state media cannot entirely counteract. For more than 3 years, the Kremlin has maintained a carefully constructed information environment in which the war in Ukraine is presented to the Russian domestic audience as a distant, manageable, and ultimately successful military operation conducted against a regime controlled by foreign enemies. The fires at Novokuibyshevsk and Gorky do not fit that narrative. They cannot be explained within it. They represent the war arriving inside Russia in a form that ordinary Russian citizens can see and understand. The anti-war sentiment that has always existed beneath the surface of Russian society, suppressed by pervasive censorship, by harsh legal penalties for public dissent, and by the genuine nationalist sentiment that some portion of the population holds, has found new expression in the wake of the strikes. Reports from independent Russian monitoring organizations document protests, however small, in multiple cities. Social media posts expressing fear, anger at the government's failure to protect Russian civilians and infrastructure, and open questioning of the war's purpose and prospects have proliferated on platforms that Russian authorities monitor but cannot fully control without disconnecting from the global internet entirely, a step that would itself carry enormous domestic and international costs. Within the Russian political establishment, the most significant development has been the increasingly open expression of dissatisfaction within the State Duma. Russian parliamentary politics have long been performative rather than substantive. The Duma functions as a ratification mechanism for decisions made elsewhere rather than as an independent legislative body with genuine authority. But even within that constrained environment, the statements now being made by some Duma members about the cost of the war, the adequacy of the military's performance, and the sustainability of the current strategic direction represent a departure from the uniformity of public messaging that the Kremlin has previously maintained. When elected officials within a political system designed to produce consensus begin to say publicly that enough is enough, it signals something about the private conversations happening in rooms that are not accessible to outside observers. The military leadership has faced its own reckoning. General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, has made a series of public claims about Ukrainian military capability that satellite imagery and open-source analysis have systematically contradicted. The gap between the Kremlin's official narrative of military success and the observable reality on the ground, documented through commercial satellite imagery analyzed by organizations including the Institute for the Study of War, has grown wide enough that it is difficult for even the most credulous domestic audience to bridge. Military bloggers and analysts within Russia's own information ecosystem, the so-called MilBlogger community that has provided a running real-time commentary on the war from a broadly pro-Russian perspective, have become increasingly critical of the official narrative, complaining about what they describe as false claims of success, mismanagement of military resources, and the political prioritization of image over operational effectiveness. The introduction of Ukraine's 2026 robotics integration program into the operational picture adds a further dimension that has both immediate battlefield significance and longer-term strategic implications. The deployment of AI-assisted unmanned ground vehicles alongside autonomous drone swarms is not a future capability being prepared for eventual use. It is an active operational integration that is already changing the dynamics of the front lines. The ability to replace human soldiers with robotic systems in the most dangerous reconnaissance and assault roles reduces Ukrainian casualties while maintaining or increasing operational tempo. It also neutralizes one of Russia's most significant remaining strategic advantages, which is its willingness to absorb extremely high manpower losses in pursuit of incremental territorial gains. Russia's military strategy over the past year has relied heavily on human wave tactics. Mass infantry assaults supported by artillery that trade Russian lives for Ukrainian positions at a ratio that Russia's demographic conscription resources can sustain, at least for a period. Against robotic systems, that calculus changes fundamentally. Destroying a Ukrainian unmanned ground vehicle does not produce the psychological, political, or human cost of killing a Ukrainian soldier. The economic cost of replacing a destroyed drone is a fraction of the cost of recruiting, training, equipping, and deploying a human soldier. And the political cost of drone losses at home is negligible compared to the growing domestic political sensitivity in Russia around military casualties. A sensitivity that the Kremlin has tried to manage through media suppression, but which is becoming increasingly difficult to contain as the cumulative scale of Russian losses becomes unmistakable. The international reaction to the strike campaign has revealed the complex web of interests and relationships that the war has created among major powers. Western governments have responded with a combination of public support for Ukraine's right to defend itself and private concern about escalation dynamics, a tension that has characterized Western policy throughout the conflict, and that has produced the pattern of gradually expanding military support that has brought Ukraine from being limited to short-range artillery to now possessing the capability to strike deep inside Russian territory. China's response has been notable for its careful calibration. Beijing has maintained throughout the conflict a posture that officially opposes the targeting of civilian infrastructure and calls for a negotiated peace while simultaneously continuing economic relationships with Russia that provide Moscow with access to components and goods that sustain the war economy. The strikes on Russian refinery infrastructure have forced Chinese diplomats to navigate between their stated commitment to the principle of non-interference and their practical interest in maintaining a Russia that is militarily and economically functional enough to serve as a strategic counterweight to American power. The internal tensions in that position are becoming harder to conceal. For European governments, the strikes on Russian energy infrastructure carry an additional dimension of significance that relates directly to European energy security. The European economy's painful and costly transition away from Russian energy dependence following the invasion has not been completed, and the residual connections that remain mean that further disruptions to Russian energy production and distribution capacity have the potential to affect European energy markets even now. Natural gas prices in European futures markets moved in response to the strikes, reflecting the market's ongoing assessment of Russian supply reliability as a factor in European energy pricing, even after years of deliberate diversification away from Moscow's supplies. The longer arc of this conflict, seen from the vantage point of the current moment, is one of progressive Ukrainian capability development, meeting progressive Russian resource depletion. Ukraine entered the war in 2022 with a military that was experienced, motivated, and reasonably well equipped by regional standards, but significantly outmatched in firepower, air power, and logistics capacity by the Russian force arrayed against it. 3 years later, Ukraine operates Western main battle tanks, fires Western artillery systems, launches Western-supplied missiles, and has now developed a domestic drone manufacturing and deployment capability of a scale and sophistication that has exceeded virtually every Western assessment made about what was possible. Russia entered the war with what was publicly assessed as one of the world's most capable conventional military forces, and has lost equipment, personnel, and institutional military capacity at a rate that its pre-war planners could not have anticipated. The strikes on Russian cities and energy infrastructure are a direct expression of that capability development. They are also an expression of strategic intent, a signal from Kyiv that the costs of continuing the war are not borne only by Ukraine, and that Russia's domestic insulation from the consequences of a war it launched is not permanent or guaranteed. Every fire burning at a Russian refinery, every air defense alarm sounding over a Russian city, every social media post from a Russian civilian asking why their government cannot protect them contributes to an erosion of the domestic political consensus that the Kremlin has worked so hard to maintain. What the coming weeks and months will bring depends on decisions being made in Moscow, in Kyiv, in Washington, in Brussels, and in Beijing, decisions whose full contours are not visible from the outside, but whose direction will be shaped by the military, economic, and political realities that the current moment has brought into focus with unusual clarity. What is clear, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the war is no longer a conflict contained within Ukrainian borders. It has reached into the Russian heartland, struck at the economic foundations of Putin's war machine, and demonstrated that the assumption of Russian domestic invulnerability that underpinned the original decision to invade was precisely that, an assumption, and one that Ukraine's military ingenuity and strategic development has now directly and consequentially challenged. The countdown that began with the first Ukrainian drone crossing into Russian territory has not stopped. If anything, it is accelerating.